Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Alison Bowden, TNC in Massachusetts Director of Conservation Science and Strategy, and your host for today. We have an exciting program today. We'll be talking about how salt marshes play a critical role in the fight against climate change. We're talking with former TNC and Northeastern University Coastal Sustainability Fellow, Dr. Katie Castagno, and current fellow, Dr. Jahson Alemu. Katie and Jahson will talk about how salt marshes can reduce and prevent damages from tropical storms, new research that shows the protective benefits of salt marshes, and how these benefits can inform policy and conservation decisions. We'll also hear how TNC is helping salt marshes thrive right here in Massachusetts. Before we dive into today's program, I wanted to share a little about our guests. Dr. Katie Castagno, former TNC and Northeastern University Coastal Sustainability Fellow, is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Here, she has developed a baseline monitoring program in advance of the restoration of the Herring River in Wellfleet, Mass., one of the largest marsh restoration projects on the Atlantic coast. Katie's research interests include the impacts of storms on the resilience of coastal communities, including the effectiveness of shoreline stabilization strategies, marsh restoration, and other adaptations to an uncertain climatic future. She received her PhD in geological oceanography from the MIT Hui Joint Program in Oceanography and Applied Ocean Science and Engineering, and her master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Jahson Alemu is a marine biologist, coastal geographer, and ocean advocate. His passions are protecting the connections between people and nature, building resilience to global change, and communicating ocean conservation. He received his PhD in environmental biology from the University of the West Indies, where his doctoral and postdoctoral research largely focuses on understanding how ecological communities change, how these changes affect dependent communities, and identifying opportunities to build social and ecological resilience. In his spare time, he dives, snorkels, rock pools, dragon boats, records frog sounds, gets lost in cities, cooks, and works with local ocean advocacy groups in his home country, Trinidad and Tobago. As you think of questions for Katie and Jahson, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again so much for joining us today. Let's dive in. Over to you, Katie and Jahson.
Great, thanks so much, Alison. Perfect. So the Nature Conservancy has 3 strategies to tackle climate change. First is mobilizing action to reduce emissions. Next is accelerating deployment of natural climate solutions. And third is strengthening resilience and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Today, we'll talk primarily about how salt marshes are important tools to tackle and adapt to climate change. Since we aim to help people and nature adapt, we look to nature for our toolbox. Nature-based solutions use natural systems, mimic natural processes, or work in tandem with traditional approaches to address natural hazards like flooding, erosion, drought, and heat islands. These solutions, such as salt marsh creation, restoration, and enhancement, all work to enhance community safety, help them avoid costs, and provide environmental co-benefits. To begin, we know that salt marshes are unique environments at the interface of land and sea, and they provide a range of valuable ecosystem services, which are broadly defined as the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. These benefits include supporting services like habitat and biodiversity. So if you look in the upper left-hand photo, there's a photo of a nice bird population in a marsh in Connecticut. They also include provisioning services, such as in the upper right-hand photo, salt marshes are an important habitat for commercially important species like oysters. Cultural services include recreation, which is a major benefit of salt marshes. So in the lower left is a picture of me taking some preschoolers into a marsh on Cape Cod to look for fiddler crabs, one of my favorite pastimes. And finally, marshes provide regulating services, such as providing carbon storage or coastal protection from storm waves. I'll primarily discuss the relationship between marshes and the regulating service of coastal protection, and Jahson will discuss how spatial equity considerations can be used to strategically increase these services and benefits to a wide number of people. Salt marshes have experienced centuries of alteration, both natural and anthropogenic. And so here we're looking at examples of natural alteration. On the left is the deposition of sand and mud on a marsh in North Carolina after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. In the center is marsh erosion from waves and vegetation loss at the Virginia Coast Reserve in the Delmarva Peninsula. And on the right are examples of both erosion and deposition from ice-rafted debris in a marsh in Maine. Marshes have also experienced significant human alteration in the last few centuries. So here we're looking at an issue of Scientific American from 1868, where people are diking a marsh in New Jersey, where they're restricting the natural flow of water to the marsh. Marshes have also been ditched and diked extensively, whether it's for mosquito control or draining the land for the production of salt marsh hay. As a result of this natural and anthropogenic alteration, and especially urbanization, salt marshes have been lost at a truly alarming rate. A 2005 study analyzed historic images and maps and found that over the last 2 to 3 centuries, an average of 37% of the salt marshes in New England have been lost. In the Boston area, that number climbs to 81%. When we lose salt marshes, we lose their associated ecosystem services. Salt marsh restoration seeks to restore these ecosystem services through removing tidal restrictions, removing invasive species, and replanting lost vegetation, among several other techniques. Here's a conceptual diagram of the ecosystem services associated with the restoration of the Herring River in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, which is the project that I'm currently working on with the Center for Coastal Studies. So there's a lot to take in here, and that's really the point. As you can see, restoring tidal range and salinity, which is, in the case of the Herring River, going to be done through removing a large tidal restriction. All of these things bolster many different ecosystem services. So as I mentioned, today I'm going to primarily discuss that relationship between salt marshes and coastal protection. To begin, we know that coastal communities are growing more vulnerable to storm impacts. So here we see the yearly economic loss from tropical cyclones from the year 1900 to 2016. At first glance, it looks like storms are getting more destructive. Economic loss, so shown here on your y-axis in billions of dollars, appears to be following a positive trend as time goes on. However, when we normalize these numbers by wealth, we see no larger trend in losses. What's happening here is that wealth has concentrated along vulnerable coastlines and continues to concentrate as time goes on. So to show you what this looks like, here's an example of part of a marsh system in Dennis, Massachusetts from 1938. By 2018, less than a century later, what was once open space has been densely populated and become more vulnerable to climate change and intense storms. Maximizing coastal protection is particularly important because intense hurricanes are expected to increase in frequency. Here, we're looking at a simplified graph showing what climate models suggest in terms of the percent of tropical cyclones that form and become major hurricanes in the Atlantic. And what this is saying is that by the end of the century, almost half of the hurricanes that form will be Category 3 or higher. Salt marshes play a really important role in all of this because they act as buffers to storm waves. We've seen this with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. Both hurricanes made landfall at similar intensities as Category 3 storms, but Hurricane Rita was significantly less deadly and destructive because it had to travel over 15 to 30 miles of wetland before it reached a populated city. Hurricane Katrina traveled over relatively fewer wetlands before making landfall, and those wetlands were significantly degraded, so they were less able to provide the ecosystem service of storm wave attenuation. A TNC study found that wetlands regionally prevented $625 million in direct flood damages from Hurricane Sandy. But of course, as we can see from this New York Times headline, wetlands are still threatened by a variety of natural and human impacts. So here are some results from a manuscript we published in Scientific Reports last month, where we analyzed marsh damage from high-resolution aerial imagery in the Florida Panhandle from Hurricane Michael. Hurricane Michael was a 2018 hurricane that made landfall as a Category 5 storm, and it was the first hurricane to make landfall as a Category 5 in the continuous United States since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. As you can see here, portions of the Panhandle, which are marked here in the bright red, were exposed to wind speeds greater than 60 meters per second, which is 135 miles an hour. So it's a really intense storm. Here are some examples of the types of damage we identified using that high resolution imagery, which was from Google Earth and taken a few days after the storm. Here they're sorted left to right by the amount of damage we identified. First, and most commonly at 80% of the damage we identified, we saw the deposition of sediment or rack, where that light tan color that you see here on the marsh is actually a thick layer of rack, so plant debris that was deposited along the edge of the marsh. And this rack forms a thick layer on the marsh and can kill the vegetation underneath it. Second, at 7%, we can go back one slide. We're gonna spend a little time on this slide. At 7% of the damage identified, there were many fallen trees that had fallen directly on the marsh, largely as a result of high winds. Third, we saw vegetation loss, where parts of a previously vegetated marsh had experienced the full removal of vegetation, usually through wave action or flooding. Fourth, we saw that parts of the marsh were converted to open water. So if we look at these ponds here, those didn't exist before the storm. And that ponding was least likely to recover out of all of the damage types. We also saw man-made debris like boats or broken boardwalks on the marsh. And we also occasionally saw lateral erosion of the shoreline, where there was a significant loss in shoreline between pre and post-storm imagery. But ultimately, however, we see that marshes are largely resistant to storm damage. We analyzed more than 42 million acres of marsh, and only 2% was damaged after Hurricane Michael. So this is great news for the ability of marshes to provide coastal protection without failing. As I mentioned, we also looked at the ability of a marsh to recover once damaged. So here we're looking at an example of pre-storm aerial imagery from 2015, where we see a fairly lush looking marsh. A couple days after the landfall of Hurricane Michael, we saw that big portions of the marsh had what appeared to be deposition of sand and rack, and that's indicated by those dashed lines. 6 months later, however, we saw that several portions of the marsh had recovered, which is indicated again by those dashed lines, but other parts didn't. We can still see some remnants of where the sand or where the rack had been. What's really interesting is that our analysis found that damaged marshes are less likely to recover and therefore remain more vulnerable to future storm impacts. So of that 2% of damaged marsh across the 3 counties we analyzed in the Florida Panhandle, only 16% had recovered within 6 months of Hurricane Michael, which really speaks to the question of if marshes are resilient to storm impacts or only resistant to a certain point of failure. We found that post-storm management activities, such as removing storm-deposited rack before it could kill the vegetation underneath it, could help bolster the ability of these marshes to recover, and also help bolster their subsequent ecosystem services of coastal protection. We also found that marshes on publicly managed land were less likely to be damaged and more likely to recover quickly from storm impacts than marshes on private land, which again really emphasizes the need to incentivize marsh management on those private lands. It's important to remember, however, that compared to bulkheads and other hard armoring techniques used commonly in the area for coastal protection, marshes perform spectacularly well, especially for such an intense storm. 76% of bulkheads in a North Carolina study were damaged after Hurricane Irene, which was only a Category 1 hurricane. And a large portion of bulkheads and revetments in a study in the Florida Keys were damaged after Hurricane Irma, which made landfall as a Category 4 storm. And so again, our study found that only 2% of marshes in the Florida Panhandle were damaged after experiencing landfall from a Category 5 hurricane. And while only 16% of the marshes had begun to recover within 6 months of the storm, it's important to remember that marshes do have the capacity to recover on their own, whereas hard armoring requires significant human intervention for repair. This is really exciting news for the ability of salt marshes to withstand intense storm events while continuing to provide coastal protection ecosystem services. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jahson to discuss some of his past and present work as the next Coastal Sustainability Postdoctoral Fellow with Northeastern and TNC.
Uh, thank, thank you, Katie. Um, I'm the new Coastal Sustainability Fellow. So I don't have, I guess, a study to share with you as yet, but I'd like to take you on a journey um, from my past experience. So what I plan on doing here in Boston on salt marshes. And thanks again, Katie, for setting that foundation, emphasizing the value of natural landscapes in protecting the coast. And I'm probably going to transition into coastal communities. But before I progress, just full disclosure, I am not a salt marsh specialist. My background is in coral reef ecology. I love all things ocean and aquatic. And if I'm being honest about it, I'm more of a naturalist than anything. So monitoring the abundance and diversity of coral reefs and mangroves, they came natural to me and made up a big part of my background. So I naturally found purpose in trying to protect and conserve these ecosystems. Next. Then somewhere in and around 2014, I was on a reef patrol boat. This was in the Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago. So we were in the marine park and we picked up this guy who was poaching. And I remember him distinctly. He had these two broken flippers. One was red, one was green. He had a makeshift spear made of the spoke from an old bicycle, and he had this mask that was made out of like an old Coke bottle or Pepsi bottle or something. It was very makeshift. All right. He had a pretty sizable catch as well. He had conch, lobster, fish. He had a whole bunch of things. All right. In our framework, that was easily finable, and in U.S. currency, he would have been fined some in the vicinity of $50,000. And I also knew this guy, and he would be what you would describe as socially vulnerable. He did the only thing that he knew to support his family. About the same time, the wider Caribbean, but Trinidad and Tobago was experiencing declining reef health, as well as the invasion of the lionfish, which was threatening already declining fish stocks, as well, and more broadly, fisheries and tourism revenues. So at the national level, and this is what I was working at the national level, elaborate plans were being developed to manage these situations. And I would admit I was part of developing a lot of and they were pretty elaborate, some of them. The management plans, they were meant to benefit a lot of the affected communities, being fishers, divers, hotel operators, etc. The reality, though, was our approach was very siloed. And if I'm being honest, community participation, it was largely tokenistic. Next. So just to quickly illustrate, I'll just give one example from my past experience to try to link to what I'm going to try to do here. So to quickly illustrate, probably one of my favorite projects working on back home was with the lionfish. The long and short of it was that there was a perception I was going to have a negative impact on fisheries and livelihoods. And despite shared perspectives across a range of stakeholders, these would be divers, snorkelers, fishers, restaurateurs, beachgoers, etc., a shared perspective that this fish was going to have a negative impact both on the ecosystem and on their livelihoods, and that the states or they themselves should be activated to try to remove these fish, which was done. I guess the larger management decision that was done or promoted was for the consumption of the lionfish as a delicacy, which is a viable management strategy. And it worked, and there was a small market, which continues today. A small market emerged. So a success story in some regard, right? So people are catching it and people are consuming it, managing this fishery. However, the unintended consequence was a marked increase in envenomation amongst fishers, their families, including their partners and children. And that's because even though there was a small demand, the demand outstripped supply. And what we found was which basically increased the risk to the people capturing them which in this case were largely the more vulnerable in society, including this guy that I mentioned with the mismatched flippers. Next. So it was like, it was shortly after that, I guess, that I came to realize that the lack of communication and understanding and cohesiveness, I guess, among different stakeholder groups, it complicated our shared vision for sustainable coastline, sustainable ecosystems. And the integration of diverse perspectives, which we didn't do here, because, well, in the lionfish example, else we would have recognized the potential for risk to family members, not the direct beneficiaries the direct stakeholders that we were interacting with. But the integration of diverse perspectives into decision-making, including those of the socially disadvantaged, people of color, a larger women presence, which in this case was not a case, as well as people within the LGBTQ community. The integration of these perspectives into adaptation and mitigation frameworks ultimately is the backbone of coastal resilience. So if I had to just rip off of the title of this webinar, I would also argue that coastal communities or communities broadly are also at the front lines of climate change. Next. Next. Right, yeah. So whereas my focus before was on coral reefs, in the era of climate change, my focus has shifted greatly to looking at the diversity of relationships between people and coastal spaces and trying to find opportunities to enhance the distribution of ecosystem services, some of which Katie mentioned, as well as the benefits that the benefits through coastal restoration, nature-based solutions that human interventions are meant to provide. So over the next couple of years in this position in Boston and beyond, there are two main questions I'm seeking to try to get some more insight on. The first being trying to understand how increasing diversity of stakeholders affects which ecosystem services we focus on and what they're managed for. And secondly, how our losses or gains, basically human interventions, likely to influence our current and future use, benefits, well-being, especially in the age of, or in the era of climate change. So that's my vision for the next couple of years, springboarding basically from the insights of Katie's study. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Katie and Jahson, for sharing your knowledge with us. It's really wonderful to see how harnessing the power of nature can be so powerful for buffering the impacts of climate change. So let's dive into some audience questions. And just as a reminder, as you think of questions for Katie and Jahson, go ahead and enter them in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'll start with one for Katie. Your latest research shows the important role that salt marshes play in protecting communities, but that damaged salt marshes are slow to recover. How can we prevent damage to salt marshes in the first place?
A really great question. So one of the things that was so interesting about the study that we found was that those marshes on those publicly managed lands did a lot better in terms of the storms. And so the reason for thinking, okay, marshes on publicly managed lands probably aren't as altered. They might have had some sort of restoration or enhancement taking place. And so really kind of the big takeaway for that would be really making sure your marsh is as healthy as it can be, whether that's looking into restoration options or enhancement options, but really kind of trying to make sure that your marsh is as healthy as it can so that when it, if it does take a hit from a storm, it can persist.
Excellent. So Jahson, you've studied coastal resilience across different parts of the world. What are some of the similarities and differences you've noticed about coastal communities and their levels of resistance and resilience?
Oh, that's a nice question. So I've looked at a range of places from your classical island with reefs, mangroves, etc. And I've also looked at more urban environments, both in an insular setting and a continental setting. I think ultimately the issues are the same in that they all feel threatened by sea level rise. If you're in the Caribbean, storms as well, storm surge. I think it's a response that varies. The connection to the connections people have to coastal spaces influences, I guess, the magnitude of the response, coupled with the amount of resources available for investment. So in some places that have been, that may not be as affluent, where communities are more dependent on natural ecosystems for, I guess, protection, that need for, or that desire for increasing the resilience, natural resilience, as well as socio-ecological resilience, arguably might be a bit greater than in more affluent places where investments in great infrastructure seems to offer some short-term benefits. So the short answer is similarities being same threats. They fear the same things or threatened by the same things, just the response as a function of resource availability, ecosystem availability, and other socioeconomic dynamics.
Thanks. So here's one from Cynthia Diprenner. This one's probably for Katie. You mentioned new research showing salt marshes can protect communities from storm surge. I've heard new research also came out showing they don't provide a lot of protection to human infrastructure. Can you talk about the state of the research and provide us with any references?
That's a great question. I think one of the trickiest things about talking about marshes in terms of coastal protection and protecting infrastructure is that by definition, marshes need to take up a lot more space than, say, a seawall or a bulkhead. So we are talking about kind of, we need a little bit more, like a larger area that can basically work to attenuate storm waves. So these are, it's a really good question, and it does kind of run into those issues of, you're not just going to like put in a marsh like in front of your house. I mean, maybe you can try, but you're not going to just drop it in the way you could a bulkhead, right? So those are really important considerations really to make. But one of the things that we have been doing that I didn't get to talk about too much in this webinar is that we're at the TNC, and the work that I've been doing with TNC, we've been working on modeling basically how much marsh you need to have that sort of wave attenuation benefit or the coastal protection benefit. And we found that just like little stretches of marsh, so like 10 or 20 meters of marsh might even be enough to provide us with enough wave attenuation, or like 80% of waves might be attenuated. And so that research is coming out hopefully soon. Papers in review right now, but it's a really good, important question, and it does raise some important issues to think about.
So I'll jump to one for Jahson from Sarah O'Neill. To your point about stakeholders, what are strategies to engage with private land and marsh owners? I know we started to talk about that, so maybe you can reflect a little bit on some of those early conversations.
Yeah, it'll probably vary from place to place, and that's one of the challenges we're going to have to overcome here in Boston. So classical methods, whether through focus group meetings, a lot of these communities. And I'm thinking specifically about a particular community here in Boston. There's this connection to the environment, and they form themselves into these associations. They want to help. There's a history behind these salt marshes, and getting these entry points. And the literature has a lot of stuff about this, finding these champions. The history of work that TNC has been doing here in Boston with the salt marsh community We've identified some of these champions, and in my role here, I'm going to leverage that relationship and probably reignite past conversations. So some strategies will be fairly low tech, whether it's through regular meetings, whether it's one-on-one, home interviews, that kind of stuff. Others, however, may be a bit more high level, where these representatives of these diverse perspectives are going to be part of the conversation of the management of these landscapes. So it's going to be mixed methods and diverse approach. I'm not sure if you want specific methods that we're going to use, but just to kind of give you a flavor for the spectrum of approach, will be very from low level to super high level.
Thanks. Susan Redlick asks, what is the status of research on carbon sequestration by wetlands on the Atlantic coast? Probably for you, Katie.
That's a great question. I'm largely a sedimentologist, coastal geologist. I do a lot of work just kind of where does the mud move, not so much the carbon sequestration aspect of it, but I do know that there's plenty of work going on. I mean, I work a lot on the Herring River in Wellfleet now, and there's lots of folks who are really interested in figuring out kind of how much carbon can these wetlands retain, how does this help us out? So this is definitely an active area of research for sure. And I think that that's going to be kind of another step in terms of kind of bolstering that, like, not public support for salt marshes, but really kind of getting the message out about just how important they are. It's not just wave attenuation, as much as that's what I really keeps me up at night, but it's a lot of other things, including carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of really good, interesting research that's coming out, and it's cutting edge stuff.
Well, the Herring River in Wellfleet is one of our top examples of a place that we might be able to, where the restoration could really increase carbon sequestration and reduce emission of methane, which is another problem. So we have some really nice opportunities. That's such a big project, looking at 1,000 acres of restoration. So Woods Hole or USGS in Woods Hole has a pretty big focus on carbon sequestration. So there's a question here, what steps would you recommend that a private owner of a coastal salt marsh could take to improve their marsh? And do you know of financial resources or incentives to help defray costs to the owner to engage in marsh restoration?
I might defer to you in terms of the financial resources and incentives. I think the TNC folks might be a little bit more in line with that. But just in terms of, if you have salt marsh on your land, I mean, I think first it's important to consider, is there any restrictions? Are there any restrictions to the marsh on your land? Can you do anything to kind of work towards that? I think a lot of other things are just kind of looking at vegetation. I mean, there's, you can say, how is your vegetation looking? You could, I guess, plant more vegetation if you wanted, but a lot of it is really kind of making sure that your marsh has like good access to changes in water and regular tidal flushing.
So yeah, in terms of resources, for existing resources, the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration, which is a state agency who we work really closely with, has a program focused on salt marsh restoration. So they do dam removal, they do road stream crossings, and replacement of structures that are restricting the tides is a pretty big focus of that DER program. So depending on what is wrong with your marsh, DER might be able to really provide assistance there. They have an RFP process and can provide funding and technical assistance. There's marshes need room to move, so there's a possibility of protecting land adjacent to salt marsh that is not currently salt marsh, but given the opportunity, probably will be in the coming decades. So there's a lot of different ways that we can restore marshes that have been impacted by things like tidal restrictions, and it's also really important to be looking not even too far ahead at where that marsh needs to be in the future. So Margarita Pryor asked if there are incentives we can offer to private landowners to help them maintain their marshes. Could they get a tax benefit or something like that? That's sort of a payment for ecosystem services concept. So certainly that model is out there. I haven't heard of it applied to salt marshes, but I don't know if Jahson or Katie, if you have, or if you want to say more about that concept.
I guess I'll just say that it's mixed. It works in some places, it doesn't in some places. So it's an evolving science right now. Yeah, I think that's all I can say about it.
Okay. So we can jump to a question from Andrea Sangre. How much protection do marshes provide for the cold weather that sweeps southerly into Florida, or what are the damages?
That's a really good question. So again, most of my research is New England based. We were just kind of interested, especially in the era of COVID, of a project that we could do remotely, working in Florida with the Florida Panhandle and Hurricane Michael. But I do know that in New England, when you get a really cold snap, that's when you can often run into like portions of the marsh basically being lifted up by ice. I don't think that really happens too much in Florida. So I do think that one of the biggest things, though, is that marshes are very resilient. I mean, they've been around for thousands of years, and they persisted through like a lot of different just changes in weather and kind of smaller oscillations in climate. So they're pretty resilient. In terms of coastal protection, it would be if it's your cold weather is associated with a storm, they could be providing wave attenuation as well.
So Davy Cutts asks, mangroves are famous for protecting land in the Caribbean. Are there plants that serve similar functions in New England?
Well, I do think, so I mean, the salt marshes act they act similarly. I mean, in terms of mangroves can attenuate waves, they can, salt marshes work similarly because they are a point of a lot of vegetation that can slow down and reduce waves, not unlike mangroves, just I think not as the stem widths are a little bit smaller. Jahson, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, similarly, I mean, functionally, they do similar things. The amount of protection, it differs with ecosystems. So mangroves themselves, they're a bit sturdier, girthier, sturdier. So they can withstand a bit more wave energy. Salt marshes, however, their threshold for wave energy may be a little less. However, their density makes them this nice sponge. So it's like a trade-off between the two, but functionally the same thing, just the thresholds, the natural thresholds are a little bit different. And ultimately, the thicker and denser the ecosystem is, the better it's able to do what it's doing in terms of reducing wave energy and ultimately reducing coastal flooding and erosion processes.
So this is a question for Katie. You mentioned that marshes on public lands were less likely to be damaged and recovered more quickly. Was this across the board for all types of public marshes, or are there significant differences in damage levels or recovery rates between municipal, state, or federally managed marshes?
That's a really good question. So we chose to lump them all together. There weren't really significant differences between like those different levels of municipalities. So great question. Looking at it kind of on a large scale view. We mostly were just looking at public versus private.
So maybe Jahson would like to pick this one up. From Barbara Keller, in the face of rising sea levels and consequent loss of marshes and lack of land for their migration inland, what do you anticipate will be the status of these marshes in the future?
That's a tough one. It comes down to sediment transport. If marshes are unable to retain sediment, or if there's a net export of sediment, if they're eroding functionally, then the stark reality is we run the risk of these open marshes becoming open ocean. It's not to say that that's the only possible scenario. Human interventions, nature-based solutions can be used to try to affect sedimentation processes, to encourage greater sedimentation. So even though there's no landward retreat, at least you can increase elevation. So that's one possible scenario. The optimal scenario is that the mangroves, not mangroves, sorry, the salt marshes themselves. Actually, sorry, no, that's it, just one scenario. The other one I think isn't realistic. So.
Is it fair to say that the no action scenario, that with no emphasis on salt marsh restoration or opportunities for landward migration, that the result is we will have very little salt marsh? It will transition to something else?
I think if salt marshes function like how we expect seagrasses, mangroves, coral reefs to, their ability to trap sediment gives them the potential to either migrate further to shallower areas or to accrete higher. If they are, however, unable to outcompete rising seas, then I think we're looking at probably a loss within that area, maybe some migration to nearby areas, but we're probably looking at a open ocean type scenario, unless we're able to do something about the elevations in the area, I think.
I can jump in on that.
Sure.
In terms of lifespan of the marsh. So folks at USGS and Woods Hole are doing a lot of work in terms of marsh lifespan, and that is, as Jahson was saying, related to the elevation and the sediment budget of the system. And again, to kind of plug this paper that at some point will come out soon. It's been weighing on me lately, but we've been doing some really interesting work in terms of we were modeling vegetation and how much you had to restore salt marsh to get wave attenuation, but we were also looking at the lifespan of the marsh. So it's not just, you could plant a marsh really densely with vegetation and you could have it so that it's like 90% covered, and that would attenuate a lot of storm waves. But if your marsh, and I guess one of the other things that we're taking away is you could plant the marsh to 50% vegetated, and that would also give you really significant wave attenuation. But if you're only planting your marsh to 50%, then your lifespan of your marsh is probably not going to be as long. And again, taking into consideration, again, elevation and sediment budget, but it is kind of one of those interesting trade-offs in terms of restoration, where you can say, okay, we could plant a marsh to 50% and or we could plant a marsh to 90%. And if we planted the marsh to 90%, it would cost twice as much, but it would last 4 times longer. So those are the sort of like interesting trade-offs that people, I think, eventually are going to have to make.
So there's a question I think might be of interest to both of you from Bill Leahy. Can you give examples of how we can effectively increase public awareness and engagement on the preservation of salt marshes in Massachusetts? So you showed your fiddler crab picture, Katie. Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, that's one of my favorite things to do. So I've been out in the field a lot lately, and it's been really, really great in terms of public engagement. Because I mean, you're getting people, I mean, whenever you're, I mean, usually I'm out in the marsh with like an RTK GPS pulse. People are like, what are you doing? What's that thing? And that sort of engagement, that one-on-one, I think is really, really important. And I mean, you know, you can't always get everybody one-on-one, but if somebody's coming up to you and say, what are you doing? That's when you kind of start to open that conversation, and you can start the conversation. And I mean, often, even if I'm doing work that's not like right at the Herring River, the Castagno dike, like I will be, you know, I'll be off in another part of Wellfleet and be like, well, what are you doing? Like, I'm like, oh, well, this is related to the Herring River. And then we talk about the Herring River, and we talk about how it's important to restore it, and to work, and what we're doing to restore it is important. And it's to me, I find a lot of benefit in really starting those like one-on-one conversations, because I think it really helps people feel like, you know, kind of put a face to what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's important. And it's great too when you can be actually out in the field and talking to folks that are just like walking by, because they are basically already there. They're like, oh, okay, I can see it. Like I know what I'm looking at now. So that's always my go-to. First things first. Or if I can hand them a fiddler crab, the goal, full goal.
Anything you'd like to reflect on, Jahson?
Yeah, I think yeah. So echoing Katie's sentiment. This is a thought process I've been trying to simplify, but it's a philosophy. Again, I come from a reef background, but I use it, doesn't matter where I am. When I'm teaching mangroves, I do mangroves, and here I'm going to do salt marshes. But I have this my reef philosophy. When I would teach, or when I would take folks out onto reefs, or people would see me working and they would ask me what I'm doing, much like what Katie's talking about, you know, I would keep saying, oh, this is my reef and I'm doing X, Y, and Z, my. And a couple of people have challenged me on that. And like, what do you mean this is not yours? And it is, because I value it. I think it's important. I'm doing whatever I can. And it's my hope that through these one-on-one or whatever engagements, that other people also use the term, this is my marsh. So that's a philosophical thing. I think also practically, I think we have an engaged audience, you know, and they just want some direction as to what they can do in terms of that behavior change, which I guess is the challenge of scientists. So as well as that philosophical shift that I think we could or should adopt. But yeah, if we could offer, I guess, more direct actions, whoever the stakeholder is, whether it's an individual or whether it's a large company, what they can do to help preserve, conserve, restore salt marshes. So whether it's lobbying or whether it's assisting with replanting efforts. So as cliche as it sounds, you know, these things do work.
So there was quite a bit of discussion in the chat about seawalls, and Stephanie Weir from TNC's Global Oceans Science team posted a paper there about living shorelines, and salt marshes have actually found to be better protection. So there's quite a bit of literature on this topic, and something that the TNC is pretty focused on. And it's a great question. And there is, we have a $1 million NOAA grant to focus on coastal resilience around New England. We did 15 living shoreline projects with a number of partners in all 5 of the coastal states. And we find that one of the fundamental assumptions is that whatever green it is, salt marsh or something else, that it is less resilient, will do less good than something that people can design and build. And to me, as an ecologist, I can't really get my head around that, because the salt marshes in New England have been here, Katie, 6,000 to 10,000 years. you're the expert on that. So I don't know about you, but if I'm taking bets on seawall versus salt marsh for 6,000 years from now, I'm taking the bet on the salt marsh, because they've been here through everything that's happened in the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. And they know as an ecosystem how to keep up with change. They know how to accrete sediment and on all the other things that they've been doing all that time. So the challenge is to let them do that, stop doing the things we've been doing that stop them from doing that, and help them where we've done things like accelerate sea level rise a little bit too fast. What can we do to help them do what they already know how to do so they can protect us and provide all the other benefits? So thanks for sharing that, Stephanie. There's a question here from Alison Sanders Fleming. Is or could salt marsh protection be part of new federal funds for infrastructure? So Katie and Jahson, you might not know the answer to that. I can pick that up, but do you want to say anything about valuation and how we can use these values of salt marshes?
Economic value?
Yeah, so how, like insurance or something like that.
So, so Katie mentioned a number of ecosystem services, and so salt marshes, you know, they provide a number of things. Storm protection being one of them, protecting property, protecting human lives, and investments in this protection can offset, I guess, long-term economic costs. So that is, in a sense, economic. In terms of environmental damages as well, the cost for restoration, for argument's sake, a hurricane passes through, the restoration costs to restore a mangrove versus the preventative work that could be done, the trade-off between, again, from an insurance perspective, as well as a damage avoidance perspective. Yeah, so from a valuation perspective, salt marshes, they offer a wide range of services. We're focusing on coastal protection here, but you know, also fisheries. There are a number of cultural services which are immeasurable. But a lot of these services, some of which we can put a dollar value on, which can help us invest, I guess, more responsibly or strategically in coastal restoration, mitigation, and adaptation strategies. So
I'll throw in that our TNC has put an insurance policy on a coral reef in Mexico. And we're thinking about ways to use data like what Katie presented to create those kinds of investments in salt marshes. There's folks working on the same thing for mangrove. So that's something that we're thinking about, is how to get the kind of investment in these ecosystems that they deserve and that we need to make to help them protect us. And it's sort of the same idea. So the question from the audience about the infrastructure bill and American Rescue Plan, TNC has been working really hard to get nature's benefits represented in that funding, and we're really proud of the results on that. There's billions of dollars in there for protecting nature for all the benefits that it provides to us. Things like road stream crossing upgrades, so those tidal restrictions. So there's money for that. So that could be helpful to the Herring River project specifically. We've been working on working with FEMA on updating their cost benefit analyses to try to get recognition of the economic value of systems like salt marshes. And we'll be trying to work with communities on getting those projects into the pipeline to actually be funded by some of these things. So we're really excited by the opportunities presented by that funding. So we're almost out of time, sadly, because it's a really fun conversation with some of my favorite people on one of my favorite topics. But do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Maybe Jahson first.
Oh.
Or you can kick it to Katie first if you want.
Yeah, kick it to Katie first.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, one of my final thoughts, kind of as we discussed earlier in terms of getting folks engaged, is really just, you know, support your local salt marsh restoration. Like the Herring River Restoration project has been going on for decades. Like people have been talking about it for decades, and only in the last few years has kind of public opinion really started to shift towards a lot of people being really, really excited about it. And just, you know, so much of that is just folks paying attention and talking to their friends, right? So like, you know, look into some local marsh restoration projects and get out the word, because I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, so the thing that came to mind was my whole my reef thing, which is which I'll just be saying again. But yeah, I'm probably just gonna echo what Katie said. Just try to get more involved. We're in the era of climate change. We're no longer talking about the year 2100. We're talking about the year 2030, 2050, which is going to be within your lifespan, our lifespan. And the more diverse options, solutions that we have to stabilize and build resilience within our coasts makes us a more resilient community. So yeah, just echoing what Katie said, investments in restoration, or just protect natural landscapes. You know, it can't get easier than that.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Katie and Jahson, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about and a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying these webinars, please share them with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. You can also find Katie and Jahson and me on Twitter. I'm pretty sure that Jahson Alemu is the only one on Twitter. It's pretty easy to find. And as always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. Join us for our next webinar on December 2nd, where we'll be taking a virtual journey to Guatemala to learn how TNC works in close collaboration with local partners to conserve Guatemala's last remaining forests and restore degraded landscapes. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.